We begin with an alarming story about rising death rates among white adults in America. WSJ's special writer Betsy McKay joins us now to discuss. Thanks for being here, Betsy.
Thanks for having me.
As you point out in your piece, this trend is shocking for an economically advanced country like the United States. What is driving the uptick in deaths?
Well, this is a really interesting study, and it follows on some work done about a year and a half ago by the same two economists at Princeton, which found that mortality was rising among middle-aged Americans. So then they set out to figure out a couple of things. One, how widespread was that problem? And secondly, what might be driving it? So what they found in their new paper is that mortality is rising not just for middle-aged Americans, but for Americans between 25 and 64 years of age. And what's driving that really is our rises in mortality in people who have a high school education or less, so working class Americans. For people with a college degree, mortality is still declining. So to have mortality rise in a developed nation is very, very unusual, and we've our mortality rates have been declining for decades.
Right.
They posit a hypothesis which is really interesting. They examined a ton of data, economic data, health data from national sources, and what they believe is going on is that the types of jobs available to working class Americans have changed since the 70s. They're less stable, more minimum wage jobs, less opportunity for advancement. And at the same time, there are a lot of social trends, decline in marriage, more cohabitation, more children born out of wedlock, more social isolation, families aren't stable.
Right, and so you touched on education and also the workforce. These deaths of despair, especially with the opioid crisis we've seen in America, they believe are leading more white adults to die younger. Is that correct?
That's correct. And they do point out that these trends were, underway before the opioid epidemic took off. I mean, opioids were really introduced in the 90s, and the epidemic has kind of taken off in the 2000s, whereas changes were starting to occur, before the mid-90s. But the opioid epidemic has definitely accelerated it. And then on top of that, you have alcohol-related liver diseases, and you have suicide. Suicide and opioids are often tied. It's hard to tell sometimes whether a drug overdose was intentional or accidental.
Right. Well, it's also interesting because these studies always look at race. And here the researchers found that blacks and Hispanics face many of the same income struggles as the white working class, yet they've experienced a decline in mortality rates. So how do you make sense of that?
Yeah, well, so that's the puzzle for everyone. What they say is that for whites, for working class whites, times were better earlier. So in other words, there was an expectation, more of an expectation of life improving. Whereas for blacks and Hispanics, they've been moving up, certainly, some parts of those populations, and there wasn't the they believe there just wasn't the expectation that with every generation you're going to live better than your parents. They also, think what needs to be explored is they posit the idea that anti-poverty programs have been of more benefit to blacks, whereas whites might not have been able to benefit from them. Their salaries might have been high enough so that they don't qualify.
Last but not least, one of the biggest stories today is the healthcare vote. We could be seeing some major changes for federal entitlement programs like Medicaid. Do you foresee those changes impacting mortality rates? Would that play a role in these trends?
Well, it really remains to see exactly what they do with the healthcare bill. But certainly, there are those estimates that millions of people could lose coverage or millions could qualify for coverage that is not as good as what they have now. A lot will depend on what happens with Medicaid, but potentially, yes, you could have a lot of people, including these people, working class whites, as well as blacks and Hispanics, losing coverage if the vote goes that way.
All right. Thank you, Betsy, for joining us.
Thank you.
A study out today by Princeton economists says that white, middle-aged, working-class Americans are suffering in a changing economy. They're living shorter lives with a sharp increase in so-called deaths of despair from suicide, drinking, and drugs. Here's Mark Strassman.
Tony Roach and Drew Arnold work as mechanics in Townville, South Carolina. Neither finished high school, and neither has health insurance.
If I get sick, I go to the doctor, I pay him cash.
Roach, now 48, smokes a pack a day.
We're all getting older.
True.
Things go wrong.
Yes.
If something goes wrong, you're going to wish you had it.
There again. Yes, probably so.
Arnold is 25 with a significant health worry.
I was diagnosed with a tumor in my head when I was 18.
Benign,
Yes, sir, it's benign.
but still there.
It's still there. It's being treated with medication.
So you pay for medication out of pocket?
Yes, sir.
How expensive?
It's about $300 a month.
In this new Brookings Institute study, the surprise involved middle-aged whites with limited education. On average, they are dying younger than other middle-aged Americans, a trend driven by their dwindling economic opportunities. John Gaylor helps direct the National Dropout Prevention Center at Clemson University.
Education brings opportunity. Opportunity in the area of employment later, opportunity in the skills to overcome obstacles.
Roach and Arnold, both Trump supporters, are keeping an eye on health care reform.
It ain't gonna get no better,
No matter who's...
no matter who's there. I mean, everybody makes promises that they don't keep.
And guys like you are have to learn how to do without.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people like me.
Less educated white people overwhelmingly supported President Trump. Scott, the study's researchers said that proposed reforms to Obamacare, with premiums possibly rising for older folks, quote, seem almost perfectly designed to hurt the very people who voted for him.
Mark Strassman in the upstate for us tonight. Mark, thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into D-News today. I'm Trace. 64% of gun victims aren't at schools or on rampages. Instead, a study in 2012 found most gun violence victims are the same ones who pull the trigger. Almost 2/3 of all gun deaths in the United States are from suicides, according to this study in the Annual Review of Public Health. And of those, most of them are white males. Homicide rates get a lot of media coverage, but due to the stigma around it, suicide generally doesn't. According to the CDC in 1997, suicide was the 8th leading cause of death in the United States overall. And now, according to this new study, white males are 8 times more likely to kill themselves with a gun than be killed by someone using a gun. Surprisingly, the data shows white people commit 70% of all suicides, far more than Hispanics or African Americans. Suicide is among the top 10 causes of death for Latino males, but isn't in the top 10 for black men or women of any race. And most of the time, those suicides are with a firearm. Why someone would choose suicide is usually heavily connected with their overall mental health. 95% of all those who take their own lives have a diagnosable psychiatric disorder, according to Columbia University doctor Victoria Arango. And she says more than half of suicide victims are clinically depressed, which means most of these white men fall into that category. You might think, they're chock full of white male privilege. What do they have to be depressed about? Well, a study in the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities found that white men do have fewer life stressors, but they lack the social support structure to properly deal with the stress that they do have. And the long-term mishandling of stress can lead down the road to depression. If it does, men are less likely to pursue therapy and will often live with depression having never been diagnosed. This research shows white men are more prone to depression stemming from stressful life events than black men or all women, although more research is needed on why this is. In a 1995 study in Progress in Brain Research, they looked at the brains of those who committed suicide and compared them to the brains of people who hadn't. All of the subjects had depression. Even though both brains had lower levels of serotonin activity due to the depression, those depressed people who'd contemplated suicide had different orbital cortices than those who hadn't. Those areas are connected to executive function, decision-making, and behavioral inhibitions. The researchers said most don't think of suicide at all, while others think of it first, because suicide victims often have trouble controlling impulses. Which brings us back to firearms. Firearms facilitate impulsive actions. Papers in the journal Crisis and Suicide and Life-Threatening Behavior found suicides are commonly impulse-driven, not elaborately planned like you would see in television and film. In fact, according to their findings, 25% of suicide attempters said that they deliberated for less than 5 minutes. In fact, most, 75%, debate less than an hour, and only 13% thought about it for more than a day. Because guns are point and click, it stands to reason when depressed men making an impulsive action like suicide can reach for a gun, that is what they'll do. The Harvard Health Policy Review looked at academic literature connecting suicide and access to firearms and found having a gun slightly increases suicide risks overall. And the journal Trauma found rates of suicide in states with the most gun ownership was twice that of the states with least gun ownership. More guns means more gun-involved suicide by a lot. On top of that, according to a Pew Research Center study, men own 3 times the number of guns, while whites own more than double the number of blacks and 3 times that of Hispanics. It would seem the reason white men are 8 times more likely to commit suicide with a gun is because they're depressed, have no way to deal with it, have a gun in their home, and have decided to use it after only a few minutes. Study after study shows reducing access to guns saves lives and reduces suicide rates, and this might be one of the reasons why. If you need help, call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255, and of course, you can always reach out to friends and family. If you want to know more about what time of year people are more likely to commit suicide, check out this video here.
A new study done by the U.S. Census Bureau shows Caucasians could be a minority sooner than previously thought. While the white population is aging quickly, many white Americans are delaying their decision to have a family. And as a result, the population is decreasing and minority groups are growing at a rapid speed. Correspondent Ashley Banks has more.
For the first time in U.S. history, more white people died than were born in 2016. Data shows in 26 states, whites are dying faster than they're being born. Between 1999 and 2016, the number of white births fell by 10.8%. That stands at just over 2 million. Researchers suggest the reasons for this decrease are the Great Recession, a drop in fertility rates because people can't afford to have children, and a rise in mortality rates, as most of the white population is aging and dying of natural causes, while others are dying from drug overdoses. A demographer at the University of Texas at San Antonio and a co-author of the report says it seems that white people going under the 50% of the population mark might be happening a few years earlier than projected. Some of the states most affected by this shift are Oregon, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, North and South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Michigan. Researchers are predicting by the year 2045, whites could drop well below 50% of the population. While the white population is decreasing, the census says minority populations are steadily rising. In 2017, the Hispanic population rose to 58.9 million, up 2.1% from 2016. The African American population rose to 47.4 million, up 1.2% from last year, and the Asian population rose to 22.2 million people, up 3.1% from 2016. The study shows although birth rates are falling at an alarming rate for whites, they're also falling amongst other races, citing there's a lack of young people supporting baby boomers. In Washington, Ashley Banks, RT.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.
Birds flying high, you know how I feel. Sun in the sky, you know how I feel. Breeze drifting on by, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day. It's a new life for me, yeah. It's a right for me.